Though Dyer's father had been highly rated amongst the Yolopau's premier engineers, Dyer had been disqualified from the program at the introductory interview. The shame and disappointment in his father's eyes still burned him, though he and Mom had been dead for some time. His dislike for this life removed some of the guilt. Living life in the districts was bad enough without existing in some fantasy world with arbitrary clinical parameters. No, Dyer preferred chasing men through bedlam struck in the lobbies of hotel casinos, shootouts in the old industrial sector, or at least he pretended to. Dyer scratched his chin and once again tried to focus on what his sponsor was saying. Tort was a tall, deceptively strong piece of shit sitting in the front passenger seat. He was Dyer's sponsor, which meant that he collected a cut from Dyer every week in exchange for aggrandized pointers, verbalized if they were passed down from the haloed profits. And Dyer supposed that some of it would have been useful, before he had traveled with the coat, before he had locked eyes with the man he intended to kill. Tort spoke with the theatrics that could only come from a true pimp. His entire demeanor seemed an act. But from what Dyer had gleaned from his peers, the bullshit stories and hustler persona was a pretty dressing for something far more disturbing. Tort had just been promoted and was finally allowed to wear a mane on his coat. Their chamber's colors were gray coats and black fur that was stitched into the lapels and collar. Dyer thought it made Tort look a little silly, especially with the gaudy jewelry he was wearing already. Odd, thought Dyer, as manes usually added to a senior griefer's frightening presence. He lied back and tried to picture what his own coat would look like with a mane, no longer just a neighborhood king. "You got a kid?" Dyer said, catching half of what was said. Most seniors said little to their juniors, and he supposed that Tort was trying to fill in the gaps. "I got a few. I just had one at a time. So, we was leaving the club, right?" Tort said. So many of his stories seemed to take place at Trins, a nightclub that their chamber had taken over just recently. It was formerly a party spot for celebrities, gangsters, and whoever else was plugged into the scene at the time. "So we was outside, and the valet motherfucker pulled up, and we started getting in, and I heard one of them girls bitching about something. So I get out, and I'm like, 'What, bitch?' She says ain't no more room, and I'm like, 'It's plenty.' She says my little man's baby seat is in the way, and she ain't sitting on nobody's lap. I couldn't put it in the trunk because I had my subs in there. So I'm like, 'Bitch, sit in the goddamn baby seat,'" Tort said, laughing as he finished. Dyer forced a smile, and the square silhouetted driver said nothing. "So yeah, I was like, 'Well, I'm leaving then.' And she was like, 'Hell no, I ain't sitting in that shit.' So I'm like, 'Look, bitch, either you ride in that bucket or we leaving your ass," Tort said. "Did she?" Dyer said. "Fuck yeah. Any woman walk around Steveltown past taps is a banger, a hoe, or a fucking ghost, 'cause she dead. Hold up. There he is. All you, D," Tort said, gesturing to a man with a long finger. Dyer narrowed his eyes as he looked through the tinted windows, completely black to those on the outside. Instinctively, he reached into his coat and felt his weapons hanging from the breakaway straps in the lining. The all-black cab crept silently near the sidewalk, and Dyer hopped out smoothly as the cab crept on. He squeezed hard fists and felt his muscles prepare for work. Though he remained indifferent to the violence that he had enacted, he enjoyed a hunt. Griefers tended to possess attributes that made it easy to separate them from a crowd. Large stature or unusual scars, but many could tell just from the look in their eyes, even before the obligatory yellowness had set in. And if one would stare into them, there was something there that was not quite a man. Slowly, some other was taking his place. Underneath this coat was a mobile gun locker that never seemed to slow him down. Even as Dyer jostled down the street, nothing he was carrying made a sound. He stepped up onto the curb, unconsciously parting the crowd with his presence, as he confirmed his target with a peek at his phone. It was an image of a seemingly mild-mannered man pulled from a security camera. Dyer was following a man that was a confirmed skimmer, a renegade of the tech industry who routed illegal power to charge fuel cells used by unregistered cyborgs. Generally, these people tended to be jaded, overworked staff employed to the power plants, but there had been an increase in those who were self-taught at skimming. a dangerous way to feed yourself or your loved ones, as any error would bring an instant death to anyone in the vicinity of the tap pipeline. Dyer looked back up to the mark he was following, burning the image in his mind. If a chase began, there would be little time to confirm before the capture. He slipped through a line of people waiting for overpriced sandwiches that cost nearly nothing to produce. He wondered if people knew the truth about the food processing industry. Would they take to the streets with violence? Perhaps not. The media had made the rebels' pirate messages and corner preaching look like conspiracy jabber. Besides, the people seemed to be comfortable where they were. Reaching up to grasp at an object whose existence was not certain was more than an inconvenience to the masses. It was insanity. And anyone who did so could take their blather to the urban squalor surrounding the prisons and the power plant. Dyer watched as his mark, known as Quid, turned a corner and entered a new area of the city. There was no vehicle traffic here, and people had flooded the streets, dressed in outfits with various degrees of coverage. He was nearly blinded by the neon signs advertising the various sexual establishments surrounding him. Dyer was unaffected by the spectacle. His sister, Dole, had dragged him all over these parts, where she acted as a small-time drug dealer and sometimes sex worker. Dyer refused to accept his sister's decisions in life, and it was why he had took to his new work so easily. His sister was much too soft for a life dealing with cheats and backstabbers. It also helped that he was recruited, or preyed upon, by a griefer that recognized the situation being played out. If Dyer refused to be a griefer, then Dole would be taxed until the work was not worth the hassle of such deep cuts. Dyer nodded as Quid headed into an adult arcade that was open at all hours. He waited at the door for a few moments, making sure to make eye contact with no one, and then slipped inside. The musky scent of body parts not normally exposed to open air stuffed his nose. He scowled as he came behind the counter of the establishment. Tattered boxes of pornographic videos yet to be priced cluttered the floor, with only a small walkway for Dyer to daintily creep through. He plopped down in an old fold-out chair and grabbed a video from the pile and perused the cheaply made casing. He stared at the face of the naked woman on the front cover, feigning enthusiasm. He noticed her concealer deviated far from her actual skin tone, and it was barely able to cover the field of pockmarks on her cheeks and ample forehead as she squatted over the crotch of a middle-aged man. He tossed the video onto one of the piles and nudged the shopkeep that was seated beside him. "Hey," Dyer said. "Huh? Hey, D, need something?" she said, finally looking away from her magazine. She was smacking her gum hard, looking over Dyer's coat. She squinted her eyes and then straightened his tie. Dyer curled his lips and then took notice of the mess that surrounded them. The woman ignored his subtle judgment with a smile. "Which room is that guy with the backpack going into?" Dyer said. The round little woman leaned forward and cycled through the main monitor of the surveillance system. 8, she said, leaning back, continuing her reading. "Thanks," Dyer said. "Tell your sister I said hi," she said. Dyer nodded before he crept out of the booth and across the display room. He moved through a wire tree forest decorated with pocket pussies, adjustable cock rings, and tingling oils. He tried to ignore a man wrapped in shadows, leering at him from behind a drink machine, and as he passed a row of money-operated bar games, every patron sitting on the stools turned to meet his eye. Dyer sighed and shoved his hands into the slits in his coat, lightly palming his weapons. Most of these men were harmless, but he could never be sure who would raise a hand against him. He had found spies in worse places. Since he had been fitted for this strange coat, he felt a creeping paranoia around people he had no personal connection with. Somehow, he swore he could feel their thoughts, or at least their intentions. The men greedily eyeing him were locked in a sexual trance, but the goddess, with her multi-voiced whispers, said that there was no threat here. Maybe, he thought, the longing gazes were for another further back. After all, he had lived long enough to don the coat, a lifestyle which would not lend oneself to beauty's flimsy grasp. As he entered the alley of booths, he could hear the obnoxious soul-scarring audio tracks of a series of porno flicks. He plodded further down the dimly lit hall, light vivisected by the grating above, until he was standing in front of room 8. As Dyer lowered his chin, he squeezed his face into a scowl. Before, he had tried to tell himself that he was different from his colleagues, that he was somehow better. In truth, he was, but not so much better morally or physically. Well adjusted to his environment, the Olapile psychiatric specialist would say. Many junior griefers muddled their minds with drugs and alcohol before a job. Never too much, but enough to meet the victim's pitiful gaze with listless eyes. This event called for libations, and Dyer was already drowning. This soup in his blood, responsible for all victories, the toxic elixir of enlightenment, it allowed him to accept his negative value. Where would he place amongst those other men, whose values were less than one? If even the eater struggled in the yoke, the machine had them all.